In this video, we will build a to-do list application with Next.js 13. By building this application, we will learn about the app folder, server and client components, data fetching and data mutations, and much more. We will be focusing on the technical aspects of building this application, so we won't be doing much of styling, for example. So let's get started. So here I have a fresh Next.js application open. And what I will do is actually delete the pages folder because we won't need that, because we are using the app folder which came with Next.js 13. So we will add that, and inside of that folder add a page.js file. And from this file I will just export a function like this, and let's save it and try to run the server. And we get this error that we need to add the experimental app.dir through to the Next.js config file, because right now the app.dir is still experimental. So I'll just add that over there, save it, and try to run the server again, and then switch to the browser and try to open up the localhost 3000. And looks like everything is working. We get the hello text over there. So for the structure of the application, I'm thinking that at the top we will have a text input and a button that you can use to add to-dos. And then below that we just have a list of those to-dos. And for each to-do we can mark it done with a checkbox or delete it with a button. So let's switch back to the VS Code and start working on that. So I'll open up the layout.js file from the app folder. And over here I will just add a heading for our application like this and save it. Let's see the browser. Yeah, great. And then I will switch to the page.js file. And over here I will type some code to just demonstrate our application the way I just described. Like this. So what I did here is at the top we have, inside of this div, we have the text input and the button. And then over here in this div we have the list with some simple styling and a couple of list items that represent the to-dos. So let's see how this looks. And I think this looks good. And for the checkbox and delete button, I think we will add those later on. So for now, I think this looks good. So this is the basic structure for our to-do list app. So next, what we will do is create own components for this input stuff and then these to-dos. So let's start with the input stuff. So I will create a new file over here called add new to-do. And inside of here, I will export a function. And then I will go to the page.js and just copy all this code and remove it. And then paste it in here and return it like this. And then we still need to use this component in the page. So I will import it and then render it over here like this. So let's try to save this and see if everything is still working. Looks like it is. Great. So next I want to create a new component for this code over here. And again, I will create a new file and call it to-do list and export a function. And same thing here, I will go to the page and copy and remove that code and paste it in and return it inside of here like this. And then let's import that also and then render it down here like this. And see that everything is still working. Great. So now we have separated this text input and button to its own component and this list of to-dos down here to its own component. And this is kind of important. Well, first of all, it's easier to understand the application code right now, but also because they are right now rendered as server components, but later on we will actually need to render one of those as a client component. So that's why it's good also that they are separated to their own components. So next up, let's start to work on this to-do list component. So as we can see, at the moment, we are just rendering some static to-dos over here. But the goal is to actually fetch the to-dos from an API and then display them over here. And for fetching the to-dos, I actually have an API running locally that is running in localhost 3001/API/todo/list. And as we can see, it returns bunch of to-dos. And this API also has other endpoints for adding to-dos, updating to-dos, and removing or deleting to-dos. And this is the API we will use. And if you want to follow along and check out this simple mock API also, it's on my GitHub. I will leave a link down below in the description. But you can just go ahead to the repository, click here, and then copy over here and clone it on your own computer, and then run yarn install, yarn build, and yarn start, and that should work. So this is the API we will be using for this to-do list application. And let's start by fetching the to-dos inside of the to-do list component. So up here, I will add a new function for fetching the data, like this. So first we will use fetch to make that API request, and then we will return that response that the API returns. And now we can use this function inside of the component. So let's add it over here like this. And then we also need to mark this function as async like this. And let's actually log these to-dos like this, so we can see that the request is working and we are getting the data. So let's save this and go to the browser and refresh the page. And right now we don't see anything on the JavaScript console, and that is because this component is a server component, because all the components inside of the app folder are by default server components if we don't define them as client components separately. So we need to look at the console inside of this server. So right here we can see that we got the data logged in. So we got some to-dos from the API with ID name and isDone properties. So that's great. The request is working. So only thing left to do now is to actually map through those to-dos and display them over here. So let me just add the code for that. Like this. So what we are doing here is mapping through the to-dos and then just printing a list element for each to-do, displaying the name. So let's save this and switch to the browser, and let's refresh the page. And looks like it's working. It's displaying the to-dos from the API, which is great. So next, let's add the checkbox for marking the to-do as done, and then also the delete button for deleting a to-do. So let me just add them over here real quick, like this. And let's save it and check it out in the browser. Everything looks okay, good. So next, let's add the functionality for this checkbox. So we want to be able to check it to mark the to-do as done. And when we check it, we want to make an API request updating the server saying that, hey, this to-do is done. So in order to do that, we need to add onChange handler for this checkbox. So let's do that. And for now, I will just add an empty function to test this out. So I will save it and let's switch to the browser. And we can see that we get an error. And this error is now related to the server and client components. So whenever we are using onChange handler, onClick handler, or useState or useEffect hooks, for example, we need to use client components. But since we are only needing the onChange handler for this checkbox and eventually for this delete button, we don't want to convert this whole component, this to-do list component, to a client component, because in that case, this API request would also happen on the client side, and that way it wouldn't be good for the performance compared for this API request to be run on the server. So what we will do next is actually create a new component for a single to-do item. So let's do that. I'll add a file over here. Let's call it to-do. And from here, I will export a function like this. And then I will copy the contents of the li from the to-do list and remove them from there. And then just return them from this component like this. So let's save it. And inside of the to-do list, let's import that component like this and then render it over here. And in order to display the correct name over here, we still need to pass in the to-do as a prop for it. So let's do that like this. And then I will go to the to-do component and modify this so it uses the to-do prop like this. So it gets the to-do as a prop, and then for now we just use the name of that to-do to display it over here. So I'll save that, and then of course we still need to add the use client statement for this to-do component because it's a client component like this. So let's save it, switch back to the browser and refresh the page, and looks like it's working again. Great. So now that we have this to-do component created, let's add the logic for the checkbox so that when we check it, it will update the API that this to-do is done. So I will next add a function up here that will do the updating like this. So we have this update function that will take the to-do ID and the isDone value as a parameter, and then we will use fetch to make the update request to the API. So the update endpoint is in my localhost 3001 API to do update. And the method is post, and then as a body we will pass in the ID and is done. So next we just need to call this function in the onChange handler of this checkbox. So let's do that next. Like this. So we will call it with the to-do ID and then get the checked value from the checkbox. So let's save this and actually see how it looks. So I will go to the browser and I have the network tab open, and let's click this one as done, and we get an error, and from the JavaScript console we can see that it's a course error. So we can fix this by adding to our fetch a mode property saying no course like this. Let's save it and refresh the page and then try to click it again. And now we can see we got a request over here. It's a post request, and as a payload it sent the ID of the to-do and then is done true. Now let's check if the update was successful. So I have the API endpoint open over here. So I refresh the page and looks like it set the first to-do is done as true. So the updating is working. But as we can see, if we refresh the page, the checkbox is unchecked again, but if we check the API, we can see that the isDone is still true for the first to-do. So let's fix that next. So we need to check a checkbox if the isDone is true for that given to-do. So I'll switch to the VS Code, and for the checkbox I will add a checked property and set it equal to todo.isDone like this. So now if the task is done, the checkbox should be checked. So let's see. So I will refresh the page and looks like it is checked. So that's good. But now if I try to check another one, so I will check this one, nothing happens. So the checkbox is not checked. And that's because we need to refresh this list in order to show the updated information. So how can we do this in Next.js 13? Well, if we take a look on the Next.js docs, we can see that the Next.js team is working on a new RFC for mutating data in Next.js, and this has not been published yet. So for now, they are recommending this kind of pattern that we use this router refresh function. And they have an example over here. So basically, in the component, we need to call this refresh function after we have done the update, and we will pass that refresh function as a parameter for that data fetching function or the update function. And the refresh function is actually coming from the Next.js router. So we are using this use router over here in the component, and we are importing the use router from Next navigation. So let's actually just implement that, and I think it's much more clearer what we need to do. So first, let's import that use router from the Next navigation. Okay, and then we need to, inside the component, define that router. and use the use router like this. And then we want to pass in as a parameter for that update function that router.refresh function like this. And then lastly, let's add that as a parameter for the update function like this. And then after the fetch request, we want to call it. So let's do that like this. So what this router refresh function that we are calling over here does exactly is that it refreshes the current route without making a whole page refresh. And that way the to-do list component will be re-rendered on the server, and it will make this fetch request in the server and get the updated data with the correct values for the isDones and for all of the to-dos. So that way, when the data is updated, it should show a correct checked value for each to-do. So let's try it out. So let's save this one over here and switch to the browser. And just in case, I will refresh my page. So I have 2 checkboxes checked. So now if I try to check this one over here, looks like it's working. And if I try to uncheck some of these, looks like they are working. And if I refresh the page and check the API, looks like everything is as it should. So if I check that one and check the API, the data is updated over here as we can see. Yeah, so looks like our isDone functionality is working. So next, let's add the functionality for the delete. So I will switch to the VS Code, and over here for the delete button, let's first add an on-click handler. So when it is clicked, something happens. And for now, I will leave it as an empty function because let's first define that delete function, what will be called when we click this. So up here, I will create a new function like this. And as a parameters, this function will get the to-do ID. And then since we are deleting to-dos, we probably want to do the same thing as we did with the update functionality. And that is to refresh the data after the deletion is complete. So we want to pass in the refresh function also. And then inside of the function, let's call that delete API endpoint like this. So again, I'm using fetch to call that localhost 3001/API/todo/delete endpoint. And as a query parameter, I'm passing the to-do ID that I want to delete. And then we are defining the request method, which is delete. And after this, we want to do the refreshing again. So let's do that like this. So let's save it and switch to the browser. I'll refresh this page also, and then let's try deleting this one over here. So nothing happens, and I think we forgot to hook it up on the on-click handler. So let's still do that like this. So we are calling the delete to-do function and passing the to-do ID as the first parameter, and then again the router refresh as a second parameter. So now let's save this and switch to the browser, and let's try to delete this one over here. And we are getting an error, and it's again saying about the course policy. So let's add that like so. I'll save it, switch to the browser, and let's try it again. Okay, so now we are getting an error saying that delete is unsupported in no course mode. So we can't do these method delete requests when the mode is set to no course. So there is a couple of ways we can get around this problem. And the way I'm thinking is by adding a rewrite to our Next.js config. So I'm going to go to VS Code, and let's open up the next.config.js again. And I will go ahead and add a rewrite rule over here and then explain it like this. And if you're not familiar with rewrites, you can read about them from the documentation more, but basically what we can do with them is, as they say here, rewrites allow you to map an incoming request path to a different destination path. So in our case, it means that whenever we are in the client side calling /API/something, so this syntax means that, we will in fact call this http localhost 3001 /API/ and then whatever was after that API/ in the source request. So for example, if we called /API/ to-do, then it would route that request to localhost 3001 /API/ to-do. So that's in short what that does. So let's save this, and whenever we are making modifications to the next config.js, we need to reboot our server, so let's do that. And now what we still need to do is inside the to-do component, when we are doing this delete request, well, first of all, we need to move that mode no course because it wasn't supported with delete. But then for the URL, we don't want to call the localhost 3001 anymore, but rather call just like this. So /API/ to-do/delete and then the ID. So right now, when we are using it like this, it actually routes the request to the localhost 3001 as we defined in the Next.js config over here. So let's save this and let's try it out. So I'll go to the browser, refresh the page, and let's try deleting this last one over here. And at least it disappeared. And if we take a look on the API and let's refresh it, looks like the deletion was successful. So if we also refresh this to-do list page, we can see that the to-do was deleted. So it's working. And now that we have the rewrite configured, we can actually also do the same thing for this update route over here, like this. So I will save that, and now if we check these checkboxes, it will still work because this request will be routed to localhost 3001 /API/ to-do/update. And for this also we can remove the course definition because that's no longer needed. Okay, so now that we have modified this fetch request in the to-do component, you might also remember that, hey, didn't we do a request for getting the to-dos in the to-do list component over here? And that's correct, we did. So why don't we use the /API/to-do/list without the localhost 3001 prefix, so like this, because now we made the rewrite and this should work. So let's try it out. So I will save this and switch the browser, and as you can see, we get an error. So what's going on in here? Why isn't it working? It says that failed to parse URL from API to-do list. And the reason why this doesn't work in here is that this to-do list component is a server component. So the request is made in the server rather than in the client. So that's why we can't do this in the server component. So the rewrite rule doesn't work in the server component, and we need to use the static URL for it. So with the localhost 3001 and then /API/ all that stuff. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that again, this is a server component and it's rendered on the server rather than this to-do component is a client component and it will be rendered on the client, and these fetch requests will be done in the browser rather than in the server. That's just something that I wanted to point out to you because I don't think it's really clear at first. Because to be honest, I struggled with this for a while. I was trying to understand why isn't it working, and then I realized that, oh, this is a server component and that's why it isn't working. So hopefully that will save some headache from you at some point. But yeah, now that we have our to-do component ready, so we can check to-dos as done and then delete them. Only thing left to do for our application now is to actually the functionality for adding to-dos. So let's do that next. So I'll go to the VS Code and to the add new to-do component, and let's start by adding onClick handler for the add button. And for now, I will just add an empty function over there. Let's save this and then check the browser. And as you might have guessed, we are getting an error, and the reason for that error is that this component at the moment is a server component and we are using onClick handler over here. So we need to convert it to client component. So let's do that like this. So now if we save it, go to the browser and refresh the page, the app is working again. Okay, so for this on-click handler, whenever the button is clicked, we want to add a to-do. So let's add a function up here that makes the API request that adds the to-do to the server. Let's call it add to-do, and as a parameter, we just want to get the to-do name. And then again, after the to-do is added, we want to refresh the data as we did with the update and delete. So we want to pass in a refresh function as a second parameter, like this. Then I'll add a fetch request inside of here that makes the API request like this. So again, since this is client component, we can use this shorter syntax for the URL. So /API/todo/add is the endpoint. And then as a body, we want to send the name of the to-do. And after the fetch is completed, we want to refresh the data like this. And then let's call this add to-do function inside of the on-click handler. So add to-do, and the first parameter is the name. And for now, I will just add a string over here saying that to-do1. And the second parameter is the refresh function from the router, the next router. So let's actually right now import the use router like this. And then we had to still define that router inside of the component with the use router like this. And now we can call that router.refresh, or we can pass it as a parameter for the add to do function over here like this, and it will be called in the function after the fetch is completed. Okay, so I will save this. Let's switch to the browser and test this out. So I will refresh the page and I type something over here. And next I will click the add button, and looks like we get a new to-do over there, but it has the wrong name. And the reason for that is that we didn't send the value of this text input to the server, but we sent just the static text over here. So let's modify this so that we also get the correct name. So up here in the component, I will define a new piece of state like this, and then I still need to import that use state like this. And then we still need to add onChange handler for the input like this. So we are calling the set name with the input value. And let's define a value for the input also, and that should be the name like this. And the last thing to do is actually use that name variable when we call the add to do like this. So let's save it and switch to the browser and try it out. So I'll type in something and click the add, and looks like we get the correct name for the to-do. And let's try to add another one. Looks like it's working, so the name is sent correctly. One thing we could add is that whenever we click the add, we empty this input so that it's easier to add another one. So inside of our button on-click handler, I will modify this a bit like this. So what I did here was, after the add to do, we will set the name as empty string. And just to make sure that we set the name after the to do is added, I made this on-click handler an asynchronous function with this, and then we are awaiting the add to do before we are setting the name as empty string. So let's save it and test it out. So let's try to add something and click add button. And looks like the to-do is added and the input is cleared. So now we have pretty well functioning to-do list application over here. And as I said earlier, we won't style this any further from here because the focus of this video was on the functionality rather than the styling. I really hope this video was helpful and you learned something from it. And if you did, please let me know in the comments and like the video. And if you are not already, please do hit the subscribe button too. I'll see you in the next video.